And joining us now on this, our fourth day of Countries Week, here on the agenda, Gerry Caplan, author of The Betrayal of Africa, who's going to talk to us about the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Welcome back to TVO, Gerry.
Thank you, Steve. Good to see
you
you
are
again.
going to set the table for a discussion we're about to have on one of the most godforsaken places in the world, I think it's fair to say. Michael Smith, if you would, let's start by bringing up a map so people can see where we're talking about. The Congo, of course, in Africa, with a long and mostly horrible history. There it is, surrounded by many of the countries with whom it has had appallingly bad history and relations in the past, and we'll get to all of that.
That map doesn't quite show that Rwanda is right next door, adjacent to the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
And that
becomes a very important part of this history.
Indeed, later in our conversation. Belgium. Start us off by telling us how Belgium got connected to the Congo many hundreds of years ago.
Belgium got connected illicitly. Belgium got connected because a group of European leaders got together in 1884 and 85 and decided to divide Africa up among them. The British Prime Minister at the time said, "This was great time we had. We gave each other mountains and rivers and plains and deserts. None of us knew where any of it was, but that didn't stop us from giving it to each other." What happened is, it's all very bizarre, Steve. It's almost impossible to understand. After several hundred years in which an area that we now call the Congo was deprived of tens of thousands, maybe millions of its citizens in the slave trade, the Europeans decided to make it a colony. And a very weird little man called King Leopold of Belgium, country maybe as big as this studio, decided he'd like to own the Congo.
Why?
Why? Well, what he told his colleagues was he wanted to introduce civilization and Christianity to the benighted heathens and savages of Africa. What he did was introduce a kind of savagery that had been unknown before. And it begins a theme of Congo. You can say the history is possibly complex, but there's also two or three very clear patterns that have gone on for 150 years. And one of them is people like Leopold deciding that they had the right to plunder the enormous, magnificent, endless natural resources of Congo for their own personal good, and in the meantime, to treat Africans as nothing more than savages that, in fact, Leopold became.
And rubber, I guess, was the big thing that he had his eye on at the time.
First ivory and then rubber. Ivory for largely cosmetic and luxury goods, tires for the new bicycles and new bicycle wheels that were becoming important in the West. But he introduced a little novelty. If you didn't produce as much rubber as the quotas he gave you, he cut off your hands, or his people cut off their hands.
This was sort of shockingly and remarkably chronicled in a book called King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, which was just a tremendous book about the history of this time.
Hochschild's book ends up calculating that there probably were 20 million people in Congo when King Leopold began around 1885, and when he was forced to give up his personal private ownership, there were 10 million people. They all weren't murdered by him, but they were all killed as a direct collateral result of the kind of catastrophe he caused, health and starvation and hunger and the like. And so it makes him pretty well one of the great mass murderers that nobody knows about in the last 150 years.
How did Congo eventually gain its independence?
Well, the Belgians, who had taken over from King Leopold and treated it almost the same as Leopold had, except not quite as savagely. A little group of government officials in Brussels, mining magnates in Congo itself, and the Roman Catholic Church, which virtually ran the social life of the Congo. This huge thing. They ran all the education. They converted most people, forcibly or not. They realized that the winds of change were coming across Africa. Ghana had become independent in 1957. De Gaulle was giving his colonies a kind of neo-colonial independence. And the Belgians knew their time was up. They thought if they were smart, they could put in Congolese in political positions while they were still able to exploit the great riches of the country, and not least copper in the south. It didn't quite work out that way, as you know. A man named Lumumba came out of nowhere and became a nationalist leader who wanted independence on Congo terms and who repudiated Belgian rule. And so there was only one way to deal with him, and they killed him.
Tell us the story of Patrice Lumumba. Who killed him?
Well, the Americans, Eisenhower, who was then the president, right at the end of his presidency in the United States, issued a formal formal declaration to his people that he wanted this man dead. That was because it was the Cold War. It's so hard to remember all this stuff now, and they claim to believe, I don't believe it for a second, they claim to believe that he was going to open the whole area to the Soviets. So he issued this
executive warrant, I think it was.
That's right, to kill this man. But before they could quite do it, he had an agent who had actually written a book on his time there. Before he could do it, some Belgian police and military guys got together with some Congolese opponents of Patrice Lumumba, and they beat him to death one night. And they buried him, but we think they unburied him and destroyed his body with acid so that nobody would ever find out. To be fair, for 2 seconds to Belgium, in 2001 they had a major inquiry in which everything I'm saying was actually verified. So this is not the opinion of one man.
Some years later, Mobutu Sese Seko comes to power.
Well, he was
Tell us
known
about
as
him.
only as Big Joe Mobutu then. He wasn't Sese Seko, names he made up when he decided to Congolese the country to hide from people what was really going on. There were 5 years between Lumumba and Mobutu, 5 years of great anarchy and great fighting. A lot of whites got killed. Tens of thousands of Africans, of Congolese, got killed in a terrible warfare. And finally, really the Americans who had managed to move in a strong way and take over the power structure from Belgium, they installed Mobutu, who was then who was an army general. And for the next 85 to 97.
65 to 97.
Sorry, 65 to
97,
97.
yeah.
He remained the president, and for 25 of those years, he was the fair-haired boy of the United States. There's a book on him, it's called America's Tyrant. And for 25 years, he pillaged his country. He received billions of dollars in loans from Western countries and the IMF and the World Bank. Let me tell you this. In 1978, the IMF decided to send in their own man to run the Bank of Congo, a guy named Erwin Blumenthal, a German banker. Fit all kinds of stereotypes of what a German banker should look like. After a year, he quit. He couldn't stand it anymore, and he wrote a memoir, and he said this publicly. He said, "Every penny that has been loaned or given to Mobutu in the Congo, he has stolen. Not one penny," and we're talking about many billions of dollars.
10 billion, I think, was the estimate I read.
At least. Every penny has gone for castles across Europe, for private jets, for castles throughout the Congo, and to pay off his various wards and acolytes around the Congo so that he could stay in power. After he wrote that report, in which he said publicly what everybody knew, billions of dollars more continued to flow to this man, every penny of which, as Blumenthal had guaranteed, was stolen by him, with us watching.
So needless to say, the infrastructure of the country to which that money was supposed to go
Wasn't in such good shape.
fell apart
Wasn't
completely.
in good shape. The Belgians had left a very nice little infrastructure, all based on exporting minerals out of Congo. He destroyed that. He spent a great deal of time giving little mineral concessions to various friendly multinational corporations from around the world. He created, and we know this, there's a wonderful book by a former New York Times reporter called Bill Berkeley, The Graves Are Not Yet Full, in which he documents the massive ethnic conflicts that Mobutu carefully arranged to divert attention from what he was really doing. All of this was known, Steve. That's the tragedy of all this. So by the end, by the time the Cold War ends and he's no longer the favorite of the United States, he has disemboweled. He has emptied out this country, and he has created an anarchy where the Congolese army never paid, was a force unto itself, causing far more harm than any good it might have done, where there were dozens of militias all over the place, each of them fighting for some plot of mine or some land or some natural resource somewhere that would make them rich and that nobody else could touch.
How did they eventually get rid of him?
Mobutu? Well, we have to go back to the map. If we could show it for
Sure.
a second.
Let's bring the map up again.
And we'll see right next door to huge Congo, a country called Rwanda. And bizarrely enough, the Rwandan genocide that you and I have talked about on this program becomes a key factor here.
There's the map.
There's the map. So it's not quite there, but it's that little tiny circle. There's two circles on the inside Tanzania on the Congo
eastern border.
border, right? And that's right. Thank you very much.
There
And
we
that's Rwanda. In the let me see. First of all, let me remind you. So the Belgians played this key role in turning Congo into a massive graveyard. The Americans then exacerbated it by supporting Mobutu for another 25 years. Then in the Rwanda genocide, the end of the genocide, the French intervene in Rwanda right at that border between Congo and Rwanda, and they allow all the genocide leaders to flee into this anarchic, chaotic country. And the French at the same time try to re-establish a friendship with Mobutu, even though he is discredited everywhere in the world because there is no level of cynicism and destruction to which the French will not descend in Africa, and they have many times. Hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million Hutu refugees, many of them mass murderers and killers, flee into Congo and set up refugee camps. Many are armed. The leadership is armed. The new Rwanda government that has ended the genocide demands that they be disarmed. The United Nations, which had done nothing whatsoever, as you and many of your listeners will remember, for Rwanda during the genocide, do nothing again now. The government of Rwanda sends in its military to disarm these Hutu killers, and while they're at it, they just decide to go right across the country, and they actually force Mobutu out of power. This is in 1997, and a Congo government under a man named Laurent Kabila comes into power briefly with Rwandan help and with Rwandans in key places. They split, the Rwandans are forced to leave, and they emerge back in order to overthrow Kabila, having overthrown Mobutu.
And Kabila's son is in place today.
That's because old man Kabila, who was a miserable SOB and who was very happy to run the same kind of government that Mobutu had for all those years, despite all the usual talk about freedom and democracy, he was murdered, assassinated by one of his guards. We're still not quite sure. Maybe some of the other guests will be able to describe who really was interested in doing that. Nobody minded him being killed, I should tell you that. And they put in his son, who had no capacity, who you and I could have been installed as easily as him. He had no particular qualifications. He was the Caroline Kennedy, you might say, of the Congo, to take a present analogy. And that began, which I guess we'll talk about for most of the rest of the program, that began 12 years of what's become one of the gravest, most despicable humanitarian and political conflicts in the entire world, in which the calculation is somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 million Congolese have been killed, like under Leopold, not murdered directly, although hundreds of thousands have, but the collateral damage of the unending wars and conflicts between all these militias. Somewhere in there is Rwanda, somewhere in there is Uganda, there is the government of Congo itself. At some stage, it was called the First World War of Africa, because there were 7 countries actively fighting on various sides against each other. This is not actually very good for Pan-Africanism, I have to tell you that.
And this is where we pick up the story over on the other side of the studio.
Yeah,
so, Gerry,
fascinating and complex story.
Thank you for setting the table for the discussion that is to come, and if you would, join me on the other side, and we'll continue it with our other guests.
Thanks. I hope it was useful.